Fans of Nathaniel Hawthorne, the famous 19th century American writer, will certainly recognize this house. It was the subject of his most famous novel, The House of Seven Gables. He knew the house well because it was owned by a family member. Today, 165,000 people a year will tour this and the other 17th century houses here on the property. They're all stuffed with some glorious pieces of furniture. Come on, let's take a look. The house I want to take you to next was moved here in 1958 by the museum from another part of Salem. It was Hawthorne's birthplace. Inside is the piece I want to show you. This room is the kitchen, and the museum has it all set up for the Christmas feast. And over here by the fireplace is a familiar piece, a painted cradle, very much like the one I built earlier on the workshop. But over here is what I wanted you to see, this high chair. It's made of pine, maple, and beech, and it has a nicely stenciled crest rail. What I really like about this piece is the size. It's not for infants because it has no seat belts or tray. It's really meant for a child that's old enough to eat at the table, but not quite tall enough without the help of a phone book or a pillow. We're going to have some fun building this piece. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now, the part of the project that requires the longest lead time is this crest rail. And I made mine by laminating 3 thin strips of cherry. With the rip fence set at 1/4 inch, I want to take some 3/4 inch stock and rip some thinner strips. Because the stock is higher than the capacity of my blade, I'll run the piece through, flip it over, and make the second pass. With glue applied to all the pieces, I can now set them in the jig. Now my jig is just a piece of 4x4 that I cut at the arch that I want for the backrest. The reason I like this system is because it applies uniform pressure all the way across the pieces. Works great. Watch. Okay, that's all 3 nice and tight. We'll set it aside to dry. Let's start turning the legs over at the lathe. Here's a leg I can use as a pattern. I start out with a piece of square stock, 1 3/8 inch square, because the widest diameter of the leg is 1 5/16 inch. It tapers towards the bottom. It tapers towards the top, where I have to make a 3/4 inch tenon that'll fit into the seat. There are some score lines which are decorative and also locate where the stretchers will go. The first thing that I want to do is rough out this blank, making it round, using a gouge. All right, with it all roughed out, I'm going to take my sample, and with the lathe still running, I'm going to do some layout. First, the score lines. And the edge of the tenon. Now I want to size that tenon. Now using my parting tool, I'll start to cut down for the diameter of the tenon. Okay, let's see how close. With my measuring tool, I can check the diameter, and I'm just shy of 3/4 of an inch, just a bit more. Now using my skew chisel, I'll make the score marks. Now I'll return to the gouge to taper the legs. The next pieces to turn are the stretchers, the pieces that join the legs. So I've mounted a smaller blank in the lathe, and using the same techniques I used for the legs, we'll turn those. Now here's the blank for the seat. Probably the most critical piece because every spindle fits into it. I've done the layout of the top section, showing the shape and the locations of 4 holes. On the underside, I've also laid out the 4 holes for the legs. Now the holes for the legs have to be drilled at an angle because, for instance, on this back leg, I want the leg to slant back at 15 degrees and out to the side at 12 degrees. To drill those holes, I'm going to use what's known as a radial drill press. Unlike a regular drill press, the table is fixed in a horizontal position. It doesn't tilt. But a regular drill press has only one drilling point straight down in a vertical position. This one I can move the point in and out, and I can swing it at different angles. By swinging it and tipping it, I can get a compound hole. Now I made some gauge blocks over at my miter box. This one is for the 12-degree angle. So by moving the drill press around, I can set the drill so that it'll come down at 12 degrees in that direction. And then using another block, which is a 15-degree angle, I can set that cut. If I clamp the piece right under the drill point where it's going to meet the wood and square to my table, I'll get a perfect hole. Good. Now we'll make the rest of the holes using the same procedures. Now I can only get one hole out of that setup. Now what I want to do is just reverse everything to drill the other one. Boy, these guide blocks are indispensable for setups like this. The next step is to drill the holes in the legs for the stretchers. So over at the radial drill press, I've installed a straight edge clamp as a fence, set one of the legs in place with a couple wedges so that it won't rock, and tip the drill press to 12 degrees for the front and back stretchers. Now this is where my radial drill press comes in real handy. I've set the leg in position and placed a temporary dowel in the hole that I already drilled for the stretcher and wedged it so that it's parallel to the table. I swung the radial arm around and tipped it. Using this guide block, which is cut at 7.5 degrees, I set the bit so it slants in that direction towards the bottom of the leg, and also it'll slant 7.5 degrees towards the back. I've placed the wedge under the lower portion of the leg to keep it from rocking. Now I'm ready to drill the hole. Okay, well that fits pretty well. Now let's remove the seat and start milling it up. Now I'll just fine-tune the cut using my sanding disc with the table set at 90 degrees to the disc. Let's take a look at the prototype. The edges of the seat bevel underneath all the way around. Along the back edge, the angle is 15 degrees. So I've tipped the table at the disc sander down 15 degrees, and now I can run the edge through. You'll note that the slope at the front edge of the chair is even steeper. It's about 30 degrees. Here I'm running a decorative V-groove in the top of the seat. So I've clamped this plywood template in position using a V-groove bit which has a ball bearing which rides along the edge of the template. Now I'll just reposition the clamps and finish the rest of it. Now just using a saw and a sharp chisel, I'll touch it up. Now what I want to do is roll the front edge of the seat, and to do that I'll use my belt sander. So using my 6-inch grinder, I'm taking down the center of the seat a little bit just to dish it out. After I finish that, I'll fine sand it nice and smooth. Tomorrow we'll start putting it together. Well, good morning. I got started today by turning the most complicated part of this chair, the rear stile. And it's complicated because it has an offset in it. I can't just take a straight piece of stock and mount it in the lathe between the centers, the drive center and the cup center, and spin it to turn it. It's just not going to happen. You always end up with a straight piece when you turn on the lathe between the two centers. So what I did is made a jig. It's pretty simple. It's just a triangular piece of plywood with some oak sides to it. I've made a center point on the broad end of the jig. And what I do is take a piece of stock and rough it out approximately to the shape of the stile, and I'll actually slip it in the jig. And what that does for me is it gives me a center point here and a center point here that'll allow the piece to spin so I can turn this upper section. After I finish that, I turn the piece around, remounting it to do the other half, again getting two centers, spinning to turn the upper section. It works great. Now, there are some safety concerns using a jig like this. Because it's rather large, it's going to be spinning in a wide radius, so I want to make sure I keep my hands really clear. Also, because it's fairly heavy, I want to run it at a low RPM, about 500 RPMs. All right, that's all I need to do to the lower section. I have my tenon, and I don't want to turn past this point because it's the transition of the piece. Now I'll flip it in the jig and finish the top. Now this piece is just a counterweight. It helps balance the jig. And I want to take that out for a minute because I'm going to flip this around to the other side. But because there's a turning now, it doesn't fit tightly in the jig. So I need to place some thin strips that'll make up the difference and make it fit nice and snug so it won't wobble around as we turn it. Put the counterweight back in this side, put it back together. All right. Now the last remaining section at the transition, I'll remove some of the material at the bandsaw first and then shape the rest of it with my wood rasp. If you look at the front of this rear stile, you can see that it's been flattened. It starts from the score line and goes all the way up to the top. So to do that, I'm going to return to my sanding center. Well, let's start working on the crest rail. And we can unclamp the blank and see how well our forming jig worked. Great. I'll clean it up at the joiner. Now I'll just rip it to width. The crest rail is joined to the stile by means of a mortise and tenon joint. To cut the mortise in the stile, I'm going to use my hollow chisel mortiser. Good. Now we'll just clamp it together, and I'm ready to lay out the holes for the back spindles. Okay, now I'm going to use a piece of dowel in one of the holes for the spindle to set a bevel gauge. I'm going to keep one blade of the gauge against the back of the crest rail. Then I'm going to use a square to set the other arm of the bevel gauge nice and square to that temporary dowel. And that'll become a guide for drilling the holes. What I want to do is start my drill bit at the back edge of the rail, and then I want to tip it so that it's perpendicular to the wooden portion of the bevel gauge. Now these holes only need to be about 1/4 of an inch deep. So here I'm just marking the length of the spindles. I'll cut off the surplus and complete the dry fit. Good. Now let's put the armrest on. Okay, that takes care of the hole in the front of the armrest, which will receive the front support. The last hole that I have to drill is in the flattened style to receive the other end of the armrest. I'm going to do that using a 1/2 inch brad point bit in my portable drill. I want to sight the drill so it's parallel to the seat and right over the hole of the front support. Okay, that's good. That takes care of the dry fit. Now I'll take it all apart, glue it up, let it set overnight, and then we'll be ready to bring it into the finishing room. After the glue dried, I did some final sanding, tacked the whole piece off so it was dust-free, and now I'm putting on the second coat of at least 4 coats of Danish oil. Just rub it in with a rag, let it dry, put on another coat. Well, after a few coats of Danish oil, this cherry is really taking on a nice character. I'm sure this chair is going to get a lot of use around the house.
On the way next this afternoon here on Home and Leisure, Ian Clayton visits the National Railway Museum in York and meets a railway historian to admire his collection of railway memorabilia. That's in former glory.